The 5th episode of Star Wars The Clone Wars' final season is out, finally showing us what happened after Ahsoka's departure from the Jedi Order at the end of Season 5. As this video will be relating to elements of that episode, we highly recommend you watch that episode first, for there will be spoilers ahead. Our most recent Clone Wars episode was mostly a slice of life, a showcase into the day-to-day happenings of the Coruscant underworld. This is nothing new. Pretty much every season of the Clone Wars has had an episode at least partly set on Coruscant, often showcasing a new part of the galactic city each time. This time around, however, we got more insight into the life in the city's depths more than we usually do. And this included plenty of resentment for the Jedi, as expressed by the locals. There's a reason Ahsoka's keeping her past quiet, and in this video, we'll be looking into it in depth. Coruscant, the shining queen of the core, known at various points in its history as Neutron, 000, Imperial Center, and U Centaur, was the heart of the galaxy. Even if it wasn't physically located at the center of the galaxy, in fact, it was a little bit west and quite a bit north of the actual center, it might as well have been. It was the ancient birthplace of humanity, the great capital of the Republic, a hub of trade and power. No other planet could even compare to it. Galactic City, the great sea of metal spires that covered the planet's entire surface, was home to untold trillions of inhabitants, making it the most populous world in the galaxy. Galactic City itself was a technological marvel, a vast metropolis that, by the time of the Clone Wars, was nearly 100,000 years old. Its foundations were laid in antiquity with the help of the ancient Gree, and it had constantly expanded ever since. By the Clone Wars, the city stood at 5,127 levels tall, blanketing the entirety of Coruscant. Whatever the natural surface of Coruscant was once like, it had long since vanished beneath kilometers upon kilometers of durasteel. Coruscant produced trillions of tons of waste every hour, more garbage than the planet was capable of properly processing. Though most products on Coruscant were intended to be recyclable for obvious reasons, what couldn't be recycled was processed in one of the planet's 5,000 garbage pits, where it was processed and shot off into space, where cruisers would pick it up and deliver it to one of the Coruscant system's moons to gather dust. Dangerous types of waste were outright shot into the sun, while trash that was considered reclaimable was melted down and filtered for usable materials. The massive population of Galactic City also produced obscene amounts of heat energy, carbon dioxide, and other waste gases, which, if ignored, would have quickly unbalanced the planet's atmosphere, rendering Coruscant uninhabitable. To manage these waste gases and the excess heat energy, Coruscant had thousands of atmospheric dampeners in place in its upper atmosphere, which ensured the planet's atmosphere remained breathable and didn't degenerate. Similar atmospheric scrubbers were in place all over the lower levels of Coruscant, constantly recycling the air to ensure that the city's slums remained livable as well. By the time of the Clone Wars, most of Coruscant's population was breathing air that had been reprocessed so many times it might as well have been artificial. As we mentioned earlier, Galactic City was built in levels, with quality of life decreasing the deeper one went. It was further divided into districts and sectors, though it's likely just applied to the upper levels and not the underworld, as presumably, large parts of the underworld levels of entire districts served only to support buildings topside. The inhabitants of the underworld basically lived in holes in the walls. Regardless, the upper levels of Coruscant were structured according to the purposes of these sectors, which were usually dedicated to something specific like commerce, government, or industry. The lowest 1,000 levels of Coruscant were officially abandoned, though they weren't quite uninhabited. The most ancient parts of Galactic City were completely unsafe due to both the age of the structures down there and the waste gases that pulled up in the lower levels, making the layers at the very bottom completely uninhabitable. Large parts of the lowermost levels were turned into the foundations of the thousands of levels of buildings above, and other parts of the deeper sectors were filled with compacted trash. Only dangerous exiles and the vicious mutant Thons inhabited these levels. Most of Galactic City's levels form the Coruscant underworld, an inhabitable part of the city that rarely saw the light of the planet's sun. The lowest known inhabitable part of Coruscant we know of is level 1312, which Ahsoka visited at the end of season 5, though it's a fair bet that at least a few of the levels beneath it were inhabited as well. Though it's not known how much of Galactic City would have technically been considered the underworld, for the sake of this video, we're going to class it as the region between level 1000 and level 5000. That massive chunk of Coruscant was where most of the planet's population lived, and conditions in this part of Galactic City ranged from mediocre to hellish. That said, it wasn't quite Nar Shaddaa either. There was some semblance of order down there, thanks to the underworld police and atmospheric scrubbers that ensured, at the very least, the inhabitants of the underworld could breathe, which wasn't a guarantee on most city planets. Most levels of the underworld were honestly what you'd expect from a large city in the real world, except with no sun and no ground either. Not all of the underworld was swarming with criminals and mutants, after all. Levels in, say, the mid-3000s were perfectly livable, if rather bland. The underworld's reputation came mostly from its lowermost levels, where the poorest of the poor lived and crime rings were rampant. The most notorious of these levels was level 1313, the setting for the most recent Clone Wars episode and also the cancelled game Star Wars 1313. Rest in peace. Though, as the Clone Wars has shown us, while not everyone on that level was a criminal by any stretch of the imagination, the region had the misfortune of being thick with criminals, so much so that the police down there had to conceal their faces to protect themselves and their families. It's a miracle that level 1313 was even policed at all. Some of the lowermost levels weren't, and the few legitimate inhabitants down there were forced to fend for themselves. But Coruscant wasn't just all one big slum. The uppermost 127 levels were, for the most part, perfectly fine, aside from industrial districts like the Works. The upper region of Coruscant was a sea of Durasteel skyscrapers, designed to put an awe-inspiring, aesthetically pleasing face on the galactic capital. This region was home to the Senate District, the heart of the Republic government, as well as the Jedi Temple, the towering Presidential Palace, and 500 Republica, where Galactic City's most important figures lived. Needless to say, those who lived in the underworld resented those who dwelt on the surface, and for good reason. They didn't care much at all for the Republic or for the Jedi, and especially not for the richest of the Coruscanti, who lived in luxurious surface palaces while they survived on recycled air. The underworld constantly suffered from the actions of its overlords, and they never had any say in the matter. Coruscant had suffered repeatedly in the Republic's wars. During the Tyrannese War, the planet had been repeatedly pressure bombed, causing mass casualties mostly among the underworld dwellers. During the PSG Crusades, the Coruscant underworld was all but enslaved, made to produce weapons and war material for the PSG regime. Coruscant was attacked repeatedly during both the Old Sith Wars and New Sith Wars, and each time it was the lower levels that suffered the most. Even during the Separatist Crisis and the Clone Wars, Coruscant was repeatedly attacked by suicide bombers, killing mostly underworld citizens. And during the Battle of Coruscant, near the war's climax, it was the underworld that suffered the most from Vulture Droid kamikaze strikes. The leveling of whole skyscraper blocks, and above all, the falls of destroyed warships from orbit, of which each killed millions when they struck the ground. In all of these conflicts, it was the Republic elite who caused the destruction in one way or another, and in each of these conflicts, it was the underworld that suffered. So yeah, the underworld in general resented the Republic, and it showed. When Coruscant was attacked by General Grievous at the end of the war, the Grand Army of the Republic didn't just have to fight off millions of invading droids on the ground, they had to fight off armies of rioters from the underworld as well. Separatist attitudes ran rampant in the underworld, born from hatred of the Republic, and it was only the sudden retreat of Grievous's army near the end of the battle that allowed the Republic to silence the riots in the underworld. It took days after the battle's conclusion to quell the fires that raged in Galactic City even after Grievous retreated. But even more than they hated the Republic, many in the underworld hated the Jedi. Not only did they, like most of the galaxy, blame the Jedi for the Clone Wars entirely, but they also blamed them for many of their other problems as well. Like the politicians of the Republic, the Jedi lived in relative luxury on the surface of Coruscant, virtually ignoring the people who lived beneath them and only rarely descending to intervene in their struggles. The inhabitants of the underworld knew to expect this sort of ignorance from the surface dwellers, but unlike the others, the Jedi had the audacity to call themselves the defenders of the weak, knights who stood up for peace and justice across the galaxy. Hatred of this hypocrisy burnt hot across the underworld. After all, how could the Jedi claim to defend the weak when they let billions suffer right beneath their feet every single day? So, that was our video exploring the inner turmoil of Coruscant, the heart of the Republic and the setting of the most recent Clone Wars episode. But what do you think? Are you excited to see where Ahsoka's journey will take her next? Let us know in the comments section below with your predictions as well. Anyways guys, just before you go, as per usual, make sure you check out those links in the description below if you want to join our Geetsly's gaming network, our main Discord server, and the Patreon if you want to help support us. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.